At 73, Margaret Sullivan thought she'd seen everything life could throw at her. She was wrong. The coffee mug slipped from her weathered hands, shattering against the frozen ground as she watched the baby bear disappear through the ice with a splash that echoed like a gunshot through the Montana wilderness. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, not during her final hike before the nursing home. The mother bear's anguished roar shook snow from the pine branches above, a sound so raw and desperate it made Margaret's chest tighten with recognition. She'd heard that exact cry 47 years ago when her own son had wandered too close to the river's edge. The massive grizzly paced frantically at the pit's rim, her 400-pound frame trembling as she watched her cub struggle in the icy water 15 feet below. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, her diabetic hands shaking as she reached for her emergency rope. But then she heard the snowmobile engines approaching fast through the trees, and something in the mother bear's terrified backward glance told her this was no accident. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie Sullivan had always believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite the trembling in your bones. At 73, she'd had plenty of practice. 47 years of teaching elementary school had taught her that sometimes the smallest people carried the biggest hearts. And today, staring at that helpless cub in the icy pit, she felt every one of those lessons crystallizing into a single, desperate moment. 3 days earlier, her son Michael had delivered his ultimatum with all the bedside manner of a tax collector. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore. What if something happens?" He'd stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his graduation, treating her like a child who couldn't be trusted with sharp objects. Sunny Meadows Nursing Home. $8,000 a month. The end of everything that made her Margaret Sullivan instead of just another elderly woman waiting to die. "Moving day is Friday, Mom." No discussion. She'd watched him drive away in his pristine SUV back to his pristine life in Denver and made a decision that would have horrified him. One last hike to Eagle's Rest, the secret spot where she and Frank had shared 50 years of sunrises, where she'd scattered some of his ashes and kept the rest in a mason jar on her nightstand because she wasn't ready to let go completely. The cabin felt different now, heavy with the weight of departure. 40 years of memories packed into boxes, labeled with Michael's efficient handwriting. Kitchen items. Dad's tools. Mom's books. As if a life could be sorted so neatly. She'd packed her hiking gear with hands that shook only slightly. Her type 2 diabetes made mornings difficult, but by afternoon she was usually steady. Frank used to say, animals knew good people the way flowers knew sunshine, instinctively, without question. She'd thought of that yesterday when she'd spotted the mother bear and her cub near the frozen stream, the way they'd watched her with curious caution rather than fear. The mother bore distinctive markings, a white patch across her chest and a scarred left ear that spoke of past encounters with humans. Not all of them kind, Maggie suspected. Now, as the cub's desperate cries echoed from the pit, Maggie understood why Frank had always trusted animal instincts over human judgment. The mother bear wasn't looking at her with aggression. She was looking at her with the same desperate hope Maggie had felt the day 5-year-old Michael had fallen through the ice at Miller's Pond. Her diabetes monitor beeped softly. Blood sugar 180, higher than ideal but manageable. She had maybe 6 hours before she'd need her insulin injection, plenty of time to help and get home safely. The temperature was dropping fast, though, and that baby bear didn't have 6 hours. It probably didn't have 60 minutes. The sound of approaching snowmobiles grew louder, and something cold settled in Maggie's stomach that had nothing to do with the Montana wind. The mother bear's ears flattened against her skull, and she backed away from the pit, not retreating but positioning herself between the approaching machines and her trapped cub. Whatever was coming through those trees, the mother bear was more afraid of it than she was of Maggie. The journey to Eagle's Rest had begun before dawn, when the Montana sky was still painted in shades of purple and gold. Maggie had packed carefully: emergency supplies, her diabetes kit, and Frank's favorite pipe tobacco wrapped in tissue paper. She'd planned to scatter it at their special place, a final goodbye before Michael locked her away in what he called a safe environment, and she called a waiting room for death. The trail wound through familiar territory, past the lightning-struck pine where Frank had proposed 48 years ago, past the meadow where they'd taught Michael to identify wildflowers. Every step carried the weight of memory and the sharp edge of finality. This was her last taste of freedom, her last chance to feel alive instead of merely existing. At 10:30, she'd first spotted them near the frozen stream, a massive grizzly mother with her cub, both drinking from a section where underground springs kept the water from freezing completely. The mother was magnificent, easily 400 pounds of muscle and protective instinct, with that distinctive white chest patch and the scarred left ear that made her unmistakable. The cub, perhaps 8 months old, tumbled and played with the carefree abandon of youth, chasing ice crystals that sparkled in the morning sun. Maggie had kept her distance, camera ready, heart full. Frank would have loved this moment. He'd always said the bears were the true owners of these mountains, and humans were just temporary visitors. She'd snapped a dozen photos, each one a small treasure to carry with her into whatever came next. But then came the moment that changed everything. At 1:15 p.m. the cub had wandered toward what looked like solid ice, chasing the reflection of clouds in what appeared to be a frozen pool. Maggie had watched in growing alarm as the little bear pressed closer to the edge, drawn by some fascinating sight beneath the surface. The ice looked thick enough it had fooled her from 50 yards away, but appearances in these mountains could be deadly. The crack sounded like a rifle shot. One moment the cub was there, curious and confident. The next it had vanished into a pit that revealed itself as a natural trap, 15 feet deep, carved by underground springs and hidden beneath a thin shell of deceptive ice. The splash echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the cub's terrified cries and the mother's answering roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. Maggie had seen that pit now, and it chilled her more than the wind. The walls were smooth stone, polished by decades of spring runoff, impossible for even a full-grown bear to climb. At the bottom, icy water swirled in a pool just deep enough to trap the cub, but too deep for it to find solid footing. The little bear was fighting to keep its head above water, but hypothermia would claim it within minutes. The mother bear's reaction was heartbreaking to witness. 400 pounds of raw power reduced to helpless desperation. She paced the rim of the pit, her massive claws gouging futros in the frozen ground. Every few seconds she'd roar, not in anger, but in the kind of anguish that transcended species. It was the sound every mother made when faced with their child's mortal danger. Maggie had approached carefully, speaking in the gentle tones she'd once used to calm frightened kindergartners. "Easy, Mama. I know. We'll figure this out." The bear had noticed her, of course, probably been aware of her presence for hours, but showed no aggression. Instead, those dark eyes held something Maggie recognized, the desperate hope of a mother who would accept help from any source. She'd removed her winter coat immediately, tying it to the climbing rope from her emergency pack. Her arthritic fingers worked slowly in the cold, but muscle memory from decades of camping with Frank guided her movements. The plan was simple: lower the coat rope combination to create a ladder the cub could grip while she guided it to safety. But as she'd tested the ice around the pit's edge, searching for solid anchor points, she'd heard them, snowmobile engines approaching fast through the trees. Multiple machines, moving with purpose rather than leisure. In 40 years of hiking these trails, she'd rarely encountered other people this far from the main paths, especially not in late winter, when avalanche danger kept most visitors away. The mother bear's reaction told her everything she needed to know. Those ears flattened against her skull, and she'd backed away from the pit. Not fleeing, but positioning herself defensively. This wasn't the behavior of an animal encountering random hikers. This was the response of a creature that had learned to fear specific humans. As the engine sounds grew closer, Maggie caught sight of movement through the trees. Professional winter gear, expensive equipment, and something that made her blood run cold, the distinctive outline of what looked like tranquilizer equipment. The cub's cries were growing weaker now, its movements more sluggish as the icy water sapped its strength. Time was running out, and whatever was approaching through those trees, the mother bear was more terrified of it than she was of losing her baby to the pit. That's when Maggie Sullivan made the decision that would change everything. She was going to save that cub, no matter who tried to stop her. The first snowmobile emerged from the tree line like a predator stalking prey, its engine cutting through the mountain silence with mechanical precision. The rider was a man in his mid-50s, his expensive winter gear and professional equipment immediately marking him as someone with resources and purpose. Behind him, a second machine carried what was unmistakably a metal transport cage. "Ma'am, step away from the bears immediately," the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He dismounted with practiced efficiency, revealing a tranquilizer rifle slung across his shoulder and a utility belt loaded with what looked like veterinary supplies. "I'm Dr. James O'Brien, wildlife researcher with the Montana Department of Conservation. These animals are part of an active relocation program." Maggie's instincts, honed by 47 years of reading people's intentions, screamed warnings. The mother bear had retreated further at the sight of O'Brien, her massive frame trembling with what could only be described as terror. Bears might fear humans in general, but this was something deeper, the kind of recognition that came from previous traumatic encounters. Relocation program? Maggie's voice carried the skepticism of a woman who'd spent decades detecting lies from 7-year-olds trying to explain missing homework. Then why is that mother more afraid of you than she is of losing her baby? O'Brien's companion, a rough-looking man he'd introduced as Pete, was already unloading equipment from the second snowmobile. Maggie noticed the dried stains on his gear that looked suspiciously like blood, and the way he handled the transport cage suggested this wasn't his first rodent. These weren't the careful, reverent movements of conservationists. They were the efficient actions of people who viewed animals as commodities. "Ma'am, I don't have time for amateur animal psychology," O'Brien snapped, his professional facade slipping slightly. "These bears have been flagged as potentially dangerous to human populations. The cubs' distress calls could attract other predators, creating a public safety hazard." Below in the pit, the baby bear's movements were becoming increasingly sluggish. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly. Maggie estimated it had maybe 15 minutes before the cold water claimed its life. But something in O'Brien's eagerness to handle the situation sent chills down her spine that had nothing to do with the Montana wind. "If you're here to relocate them safely," she said, positioning herself between O'Brien and the pit, "then you won't mind if I assist in the rescue. I've got climbing gear, and that baby needs help now." The look that passed between O'Brien and Pete told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was something far more sinister. The expensive equipment, the practiced efficiency, the mother bear's terror, all pieces of a puzzle that painted a horrifying picture. "Look, lady," Pete interjected, his hand moving toward what was definitely not standard wildlife management equipment. The doctor knows what he's doing. These animals are valuable for research purposes, and civilian interference could compromise the entire operation. Research purposes. The euphemism hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd heard similar language during her teaching career when administrators tried to sugarcoat budget cuts that would hurt children. The carefully chosen words that made cruelty sound clinical, necessary, even noble. "What kind of research requires hunting terrified animals?" she demanded, her teacher's voice carrying the authority that had once commanded classrooms full of unruly children. "And don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is about public safety." That mother's not aggressive. She's desperate. O'Brien's mask slipped completely then, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the professional exterior. "These animals killed my daughter 7 years ago, mauled her during a camping trip while I was setting up our tent. 7 years old, and those monsters tore her apart while I was 50 feet away, helpless to save her." The raw pain in his voice was real but twisted into something ugly and consuming. Maggie recognized the look. She'd seen it in parents who'd lost children, the way grief could either open hearts to compassion or close them to everything except revenge. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, meaning it. "But that baby down there didn't kill your daughter. And torturing innocent animals won't bring her back." "Innocent?" O'Brien's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "There's nothing innocent about predators. They kill without conscience, without mercy. At least when I kill them, it serves a purpose. Research that could prevent future attacks, tissue samples that fund conservation efforts." The mother bear had positioned herself between her trapped cub and O'Brien's team, her massive body radiating protective fury. But Maggie could see the calculation in the bear's eyes, the impossible choice between abandoning her baby to save herself or staying to protect a cub she couldn't reach. "You're not a researcher," Maggie realized aloud, pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "You're a poacher, a very sophisticated one, but a poacher nonetheless." Pete's hand moved to his weapon then, the pretense abandoned. "Doc, we can't let her walk away knowing what she knows." Below them, the cub's cries were growing weaker. Time was running out on multiple fronts. The baby bear was dying, O'Brien's patience was exhausted, and Maggie found herself facing the most dangerous moment of her 73 years. But looking at that mother bear's desperate eyes, seeing the same grief she'd witnessed in her own mirror after Frank's death, she knew she couldn't walk away. "Then I guess," Maggie said, checking her blood sugar monitor and finding it spiking toward dangerous levels, "we'd better figure out who's more stubborn, a grief madman with a gun or a diabetic grandmother with nothing left to lose." The standoff lasted exactly 47 seconds. Maggie counted them off like the heartbeats hammering against her ribs. Then the baby bear's cry from the pit grew noticeably weaker, and maternal instinct overrode everything else, including common sense and the very real possibility that she was about to die alongside the creature she was trying to save. "To hell with all of you," she muttered, and began lowering herself toward the pit using the coat rope system she'd rigged. Her arthritic hands burned against the makeshift rope, and her diabetes monitor beeped ominously as her blood sugar spiked past 250, but the cub's fading movements spurred her on. O'Brien raised his tranquilizer rifle toward the mother bear. "One more step and I put her down permanently." But something extraordinary happened. Instead of charging or fleeing, the massive grizzly did something that froze everyone in place. She sat down. 400 pounds of predatory power simply sat like an enormous, patient dog. Her dark eyes never left Maggie's descent, but she made no aggressive moves toward the humans who threatened her. "What the hell?" Pete whispered, lowering his weapon slightly. "Bears don't do that." "They don't," Maggie thought as she reached the halfway point, "unless they understand what's happening, unless they're smart enough to recognize help when it comes from an unexpected source." The rope bit into her palms, and her shoulders screamed protest, but Frank's voice echoed in her memory. "When someone needs saving, Maggie, you don't stop to count the cost." The cub was barely moving when she reached the bottom of the pit. Hypothermia had advanced rapidly, its breathing was shallow, and its beautiful brown eyes were glazing with the approach of death. But when Maggie wrapped her winter coat around the small body, the cub stirred slightly, responding to the warmth and the gentle touch of human hands. "Come on, baby," she whispered, gathering the 30-pound cub against her chest. "Your mama's waiting for you." Above them she could hear O'Brien arguing with Pete. "We take all three," O'Brien was saying. "The old woman's seen too much and she's got pictures on that camera. Can't risk exposure. Doc, she's just some grandmother. Let her go and we take the bears. No harm, no foul. My daughter was just some granddaughter to the bears that killed her. No witnesses, Pete. Not this time." The conversation sent ice through Maggie's veins that had nothing to do with the Montana cold. She was holding a dying cub at the bottom of a 15-foot pit with killers above and a diabetic crisis building in her bloodstream. The smart thing would have been to climb out, hand over the cub, and pray they'd let her walk away. The smart thing would have been to never get involved in the first place. But Maggie Sullivan hadn't become a teacher to do the smart thing. She'd done it to protect children, even when the children had claws and fur and mothers who could tear her apart without breaking stride. The climb out was a nightmare of burning muscles and slipping handholds, made worse by the precious cargo she carried. The cub seemed to understand it needed to stay still, curling against her chest with the trust that only the very young possess. Twice, her grip slipped on the makeshift rope. Twice, she caught herself through sheer stubborn will and the knowledge that falling meant death for both of them. When she finally reached the surface, gasping and shaking, the mother bear was waiting. Not attacking, not threatening, waiting with an intelligence that defied every nature documentary Maggie had ever watched. Their eyes met across the space of 6 feet, and something passed between them that transcended species. One mother recognizing another. Maggie gently placed the wrapped cub on the ground halfway between herself and the mother bear, then backed away slowly. The massive grizzly approached with surprising delicacy, using her nose to examine her baby with the tender care of any worried parent. The cub stirred at its mother's touch, mewing softly, and the relief in the mother's eyes was unmistakably human. "Touching," O'Brien said coldly, his tranquilizer rifle now trained on Maggie. "But playtime's over. Pete, get the cages." That's when the mother bear stood to her full height, 7 feet of protective fury, and roared. It wasn't the desperate cry they'd heard earlier. This was something else entirely. A challenge, a warning, and a promise all rolled into one sound that seemed to shake the very mountains. Snow cascaded from nearby pine branches, and the echo rolled through the canyon like thunder. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered, fumbling with his weapon. "She's huge." But the bear wasn't looking at Pete. Her attention was fixed entirely on O'Brien, and the recognition in her gaze was unmistakable. They'd met before. Whatever O'Brien had done to deserve that look, it hadn't been the humane relocation he'd claimed. O'Brien's radio crackled to life. "Base to Unit 3. Package confirmed at coordinates Delta 7. Move to extraction point for buyer rendezvous." The transmission hit Maggie like a physical blow. Package, buyer, the clinical language of commerce, not conservation. She thought of all the missing pet posters she'd seen over the years, the way predators always used euphemisms to distance themselves from their crimes. "How many?" she demanded, her teacher's voice cutting through the mountain air. "How many bears have you killed for your research?" O'Brien's smile was colder than the Montana wind. 47 over the past 2 years, each one funding my daughter's memorial foundation and advancing our understanding of predatory behavior. Their deaths serve a purpose, unlike their lives. 47. The number hit Maggie with the force of an avalanche. 47 families destroyed, 47 mothers who'd watched their babies disappear, 47 children who'd died in terror, far from home, at the hands of a man who claimed to honor his dead daughter through systematic murder. The mother bear's reaction suggested she understood more than animal psychology should allow. Her head swiveled toward Maggie, then back to O'Brien, as if weighing her options. The cub, wrapped in Maggie's coat, had stopped shivering and was trying to nurse, a good sign for its recovery. "The bears come with us," O'Brien continued, gesturing for Pete to move closer to the cub. "The old woman, well, accidents happen in the wilderness. Diabetic woman, alone in dangerous terrain. Search and rescue will find her body in the spring, if they're lucky." But as Pete approached the cub, something unprecedented happened. The mother bear didn't attack him. She moved to stand beside Maggie. 400 pounds of apex predator, positioning herself as an ally rather than a threat. The message was clear. They were in this together now. Maggie's diabetes monitor beeped urgently. Blood sugar 320, approaching dangerous territory. Her vision was starting to blur slightly at the edges, and her hands trembled with more than cold. She had maybe 2 hours before diabetic ketoacidosis became life-threatening, maybe less with the stress and physical exertion. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I came up here planning to scatter my husband's ashes and then go quietly into that nursing home. I was ready to give up, to let my son warehouse me until I died. But looking at you, seeing what you've become in your grief, I'd rather die free than live as something I'm not." O'Brien raised his rifle toward the mother bear. Touching speech, but the bear moved faster than anything that large should have been able to move, not attacking but positioning herself between the gun and Maggie with fluid grace that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal instinct. She wasn't snarling or showing aggression. She was simply protecting. "What the hell is wrong with this bear?" Pete demanded, backing away. "It's like she understands what we're saying." Maybe she does, Maggie thought, meeting the bear's dark eyes once more. Maybe grief and love and the need to protect the innocent are languages that cross all species. Maybe Frank was right when he said animals knew good people the way flowers knew sunshine. The standoff stretched into its 3rd minute, with O'Brien's finger on the trigger and the mother bear standing guard over both Maggie and her cub. The only sounds were the wind through the pines, the distant rumble of approaching storm clouds, and Maggie's increasingly labored breathing as her blood sugar climbed toward critical levels. Then, carried on the winter wind, came the sound of more snowmobile engines approaching from the opposite direction. O'Brien's head snapped toward the sound, his professional composure finally cracking into something that looked like panic. "Shit," Pete hissed. "Doc, we've got company." Through the trees, Maggie caught a glimpse of official markings on the approaching vehicles. Park Service. Her heart leaped with hope, but O'Brien's reaction suggested the situation was about to become far more complicated than a simple rescue. "Change of plans," O'Brien said grimly, swinging his rifle toward Maggie. "No witnesses, no evidence, no survivors." The Park Service snowmobiles emerged from the tree line just as O'Brien's finger tightened on the trigger. The lead rider was young, maybe late 20s, with the confident bearing of someone who belonged in these mountains. He raised his hand in greeting, apparently oblivious to the deadly tableau playing out before him. "Dr. O'Brien," the ranger called out, removing his helmet to reveal sandy hair and concerned eyes. "We got your emergency call about the injured hiker. Where's the victim?" Maggie's heart sank as she realized O'Brien had anticipated the ranger's arrival. This wasn't rescue. It was the perfect cover story. A diabetic woman found dead in the wilderness, with the respected wildlife researcher as the only witness to her tragic accident. "Right here, Ranger Rivers," O'Brien replied smoothly, his rifle now discreetly lowered. Mrs. Sullivan attempted to rescue a bear cub that had fallen through thin ice. I arrived just as she was pulling the animal from the pit, but I'm afraid the exertion has triggered a severe diabetic episode. Tommy Rivers dismounted and approached with professional concern, his medical kit already in hand. As he drew closer, Maggie caught something in his expression, a flicker of recognition that didn't match his casual greeting to O'Brien. His eyes swept the scene. The tranquilizer equipment, Pete's nervous positioning, the mother bear's protective stance, and most tellingly, the fresh gouges in the frozen ground around the pit. Diabetic episode, Tommy repeated slowly, kneeling beside Maggie to check her vitals. As he reached for her wrist, his fingers briefly pressed against her palm in what felt like a deliberate signal. Blood sugar looks elevated, but not critically. When did symptoms begin? About 30 minutes ago, Maggie managed, playing along while her mind raced. There was something about this young ranger that didn't fit O'Brien's narrative. The way he'd positioned himself between her and Pete, the careful way he was documenting the scene with his eyes rather than his equipment. Strange, Tommy mused, loud enough for O'Brien to hear. Usually we see much more severe symptoms with dangerous episodes. Mrs. Sullivan, have you taken your insulin today? Before she could answer, O'Brien interjected. Ranger Rivers, I think we need to focus on immediate evacuation. The weather's turning and this woman needs hospital care. We can handle the bear situation after she's safe. But Tommy was studying the mother bear with professional interest. That's unusual behavior for a grizzly with a threatened cub. She should be showing extreme aggression, but she seems almost protective of Mrs. Sullivan. Bears are unpredictable, O'Brien said tersely, which is why we need to move quickly, before the situation escalates. Tommy nodded but made no move to rush. Instead, he continued his examination of Maggie while speaking in a conversational tone that seemed designed to keep everyone calm. You know, Dr. O'Brien, I've been meaning to ask about your research. We've had several reports of unusual bear activity in your study areas over the past few months. What kind of reports? O'Brien's voice carried a careful neutrality, but Maggie noticed Pete shifting nervously behind him. Missing animals, mainly. Adult bears that simply vanished from territories they'd occupied for years. The wildlife biologists are puzzled. It's not typical migration behavior. Maggie felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Tommy wasn't here by coincidence. He'd been tracking O'Brien, probably for months, waiting for the right moment to gather evidence. The emergency call had been bait, drawing the ranger to witness O'Brien's operation firsthand, but the plan was backfiring spectacularly. O'Brien was too experienced, too paranoid to be caught in such an obvious trap, and now Tommy was in danger alongside her and the bears. Rangers worry too much, O'Brien replied, his hand moving casually toward his sidearm. Natural predation, territory disputes, hunting accidents. Bears disappear all the time. 47 of them in 2 years? The question slipped out before Maggie could stop herself. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening as he processed the implication. Pete took a step backward, his hand moving toward his weapon. O'Brien's mask finally fell completely, revealing the cold calculation of a man who'd already killed dozens of innocent creatures. Well, O'Brien said softly, that complicates things considerably. Tommy reacted with the speed of someone trained for dangerous situations, rolling away from Maggie and reaching for his radio. Dispatch, this is Rivers. I need immediate backup at coordinates. Pete's rifle fired, the tranquilizer dart catching Tommy in the shoulder before he could complete the call. The young ranger's hand spasmed, sending the radio flying into a nearby snowbank where it disappeared beneath the powder. Stupid! O'Brien hissed at his partner. "We needed this to look natural." "He was calling for backup," Pete protested. "What was I supposed to do?" As Tommy collapsed, fighting the effects of the tranquilizer, the mother bear's behavior shifted dramatically. The protective intelligence Maggie had witnessed earlier transformed into something far more dangerous. The massive grizzly rose to her full height and released a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, her message clear: enough. But instead of attacking, she did something that defied every assumption about wild animal behavior. She moved to stand over Tommy's unconscious form, her massive bulk shielding him from further harm while keeping her cub within protective range. 3 humans under the protection of a wild bear. It was unprecedented, impossible, and absolutely real. "Jesus," Pete whispered. "It's like she knows what's happening." "Bears don't think," O'Brien snapped, but his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "They react on instinct." Maggie struggled to her feet, her diabetes symptoms worsening by the minute. Her vision was blurring around the edges, and her hands shook with more than cold. But looking at that magnificent animal protecting 3 helpless humans, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Maybe," she said, her teacher's voice cutting through the mountain air. "You don't know as much about bears as you think you do?" O'Brien raised his rifle toward the mother bear. "Move away from the ranger and I'll make this quick." The bear's response was to lower her head and emit a sound Maggie had never heard before. Not a roar or a growl, but something almost like speech, a rumbling vocalization that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere animal communication. "She's warning you," Maggie realized aloud. "She's actually trying to warn you off." "Fairy tale bullshit," O'Brien snarled, but he didn't pull the trigger. The cub, now warmed by Maggie's coat and its mother's nearby presence, began making soft mewing sounds. The mother bear responded immediately, her attention divided between the threats surrounding her and the baby she'd nearly lost. The complexity of her emotional response was staggering: maternal love, protective fury, and something that looked remarkably like grief for the violence she was witnessing. Tommy stirred slightly, fighting the tranquilizer's effects. "Maggie," he mumbled, his words slurred but urgent. "Photos. In my pack. Evidence." O'Brien's head snapped toward the ranger's equipment bag. Whatever evidence Tommy had been gathering, it was apparently enough to destroy O'Brien's operation. But as he moved toward the pack, the mother bear stepped directly into his path. "Move," O'Brien commanded, raising his rifle. The bear didn't move. Instead, she sat down again, placing her massive frame between O'Brien and both Tommy's equipment and her vulnerable cub. Her dark eyes met O'Brien's with an intelligence that was unmistakably conscious, unmistakably aware. 47, Maggie said softly, the number carrying the weight of an accusation. 47 families destroyed. 47 mothers who watched their babies die. Look at her, Dr. O'Brien. Look at what you've become. For a moment, something flickered in O'Brien's eyes, a crack in the armor of rage and grief that had sustained him through 2 years of systematic murder. But then Pete's nervous voice shattered the moment. "Doc, we've got movement in the trees. More rangers incoming from the south." O'Brien's grip tightened on his weapon. "Then we end this now. All of them." But as he raised the rifle toward the mother bear, Maggie made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped between the gun and the animal, her 73-year-old frame shaking with diabetes and adrenaline but steady with purpose. "You want to add a grandmother to your body count?" she asked quietly. "Will that honor your daughter's memory?" The question hung in the frozen air like a challenge, while in the distance the sound of approaching snowmobiles grew steadily louder. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like the crack of breaking worlds. Maggie felt the bullet's wind past her ear, close enough to singe the gray hair that had survived 73 years of everything life could throw at her. Everything except this. She was falling before she understood what had happened. Not from the bullet, that had missed by inches, but from the massive weight of the mother bear who had thrown herself forward, taking the shot meant for Maggie. 400 pounds of protective fury reduced to a trembling heap in the blood-stained snow. "No," Maggie whispered, crawling toward the wounded animal despite her own diabetic crisis. "No, no, no." The bear's breathing was labored, blood frothing at her muzzle, but her dark eyes remained fixed on Maggie with an expression of such profound understanding that it shattered every assumption about the intelligence of wild creatures. Even dying, she was trying to protect the human who had saved her cub. "Mama Bear saved the lady," Tommy mumbled through his tranquilizer haze, struggling to maintain consciousness. She knew." Pete backed away from the scene, his own weapon lowering in shock. "Doc, that's not normal. Bears don't take bullets for people." O'Brien stood frozen, staring at what he'd done. The rifle trembled in his hands as he watched the massive grizzly's life ebbing away in the snow. For the first time in 2 years, doubt cracked through his armor of righteous vengeance. "Emma," he whispered, his daughter's name carried away by the mountain wind. "What have I become?" The cub, sensing its mother's distress, mewed frantically and tried to crawl from Maggie's coat toward the dying bear. The sound, pure, innocent, desperate, seemed to break something fundamental in O'Brien's carefully constructed worldview. Maggie's blood sugar spiked past 400 as stress and grief overwhelmed her system. Her vision blurred dangerously, and her hands shook as she reached for the bear's massive head. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving me." The mother bear's breathing grew shallower, but she managed to touch her nose gently to Maggie's palm, a final gesture of connection between two mothers who had found understanding across species lines. "Dispatch. This is Ranger Morgan, requesting immediate medical evacuation at coordinates 77 Delta," came a voice through the trees as more Park Service personnel arrived. "We have multiple casualties and need air support now." O'Brien raised his rifle again, this time toward the approaching Rangers. "No witnesses," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma needs..." "Emma's dead," Maggie said quietly, fighting to stay conscious as her diabetes threatened to claim her. "Your little girl has been dead for 7 years, and torturing innocent animals won't bring her back." The words hit O'Brien like physical blows. His daughter's face swam before his eyes. Not the mangled memory that had driven him to murder, but the real Emma. 7 years old, bright-eyed, clutching her teddy bear named Honey. The same Emma who had cried when she'd found a dead bird in their backyard, who had made him promise to never hurt animals because they have feelings too, Daddy. "She loved bears," he whispered, the realization crushing him. Emma loved all animals. She wanted to be a veterinarian. "Then honor that," Maggie gasped, her consciousness fading as diabetic ketoacidosis took hold. "Honor her love, not your hate." The mother bear's eyes closed for the final time just as the rescue team emerged from the trees. Her massive paw remained stretched toward her cub, even in death maintaining her protective vigil. Pete dropped his weapon and raised his hands as federal agents surrounded the scene. "I surrender," he called out. "I was just following orders. This wasn't supposed to... Nobody was supposed to die like this." But O'Brien didn't surrender. Instead, he knelt beside the dead bear, his rifle forgotten in the snow. Tears froze on his cheeks as he placed his hand on the grizzly's still warm fur. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Emma, forgive me." The rescue team worked frantically to stabilize both Maggie and Tommy while processing the crime scene. Emergency glucose brought Maggie back from the edge of diabetic coma, but the psychological trauma ran deeper than any medical emergency. "The bear," she mumbled as paramedics worked over her. "The baby bear. Where's the baby?" "We've got it," a wildlife biologist assured her. "The cub's alive and healthy. We'll make sure it gets to a rehabilitation facility." But as they prepared to airlift Maggie to the nearest hospital, she grabbed the biologist's sleeve with surprising strength. "No facility," she insisted. "Promise me. Promise it goes to a real sanctuary. Somewhere it can be wild." The biologist nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her request. This cub, orphaned by human violence, deserved better than a cage, even a comfortable one. As the helicopter lifted off, Maggie caught a final glimpse of the scene below. The mother bear's body, covered respectfully by rangers, O'Brien in handcuffs staring at what his grief had wrought, and the tiny cub that had started it all, wrapped in her coat and clinging to life despite everything the world had thrown at it. Sometimes, she thought as consciousness faded again, love isn't enough to save everyone, but it's always enough to try. The truth arrived in pieces over the following weeks, each revelation more devastating than the last. Tommy Rivers, recovering from his tranquilizer dart in the same hospital where Maggie fought her diabetic complications, finally revealed the scope of his investigation. For 8 months, he'd been documenting O'Brien's systematic slaughter across 6 states, building a case that would ultimately expose a wildlife trafficking operation worth over $50 million annually. The hardest part, Tommy told Maggie during one of his visits, was knowing what he was doing and not being able to stop it. "I needed to catch him in the act, with witnesses and evidence. I never imagined he'd target you." The FBI's evidence files painted a picture of methodical horror. 47 bears across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, North Dakota, Colorado, and Utah, all killed for their gallbladders, paws, and other parts destined for illegal international markets. O'Brien had used his credentials as a wildlife researcher to gain access to protected areas, tracking bear families with GPS collars he claimed were for conservation studies. But the most shocking revelation came from O'Brien himself during his psychological evaluation before trial. His daughter Emma hadn't been killed by bears at all. She'd died of acute lymphoblastic leukemia at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, surrounded by family and the stuffed animals she'd collected throughout her 7 short years. The bear attack story was a complete fabrication, a delusion O'Brien had constructed to justify his descent into systematic murder. He told himself the story so many times, he began to believe it, the court-appointed psychiatrist explained to Maggie during a victim impact interview. Grief twisted his memories until his daughter's death became something he could fight against, rather than something he had to accept. Maggie listened to these revelations from her hospital bed, where she'd spent 3 weeks recovering from diabetic ketoacidosis and its complications. Her kidneys had suffered damage from the extreme blood sugar spikes, and doctors warned that her hiking days were probably over. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fought so hard against the nursing home that she'd landed herself in a situation requiring exactly the kind of full-time medical care she'd been determined to avoid. Michael arrived on the second day, his face haggard with guilt and fear. "Mom, what were you thinking? You could have died out there." "I was thinking," Maggie replied quietly, "about what kind of person I wanted to be in my final years, about whether I'd rather die safe and useless or take one last stand for something that mattered. But it was just a bear, Mom." "Just an animal. Just an animal that threw herself in front of a bullet to save me," Maggie corrected, her voice carrying the weight of witnessed sacrifice. "That just an animal had more courage and compassion than most humans I've known." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Michael had come prepared to lecture his mother about reckless endangerment, but found himself confronting a woman who had stared death in the face and emerged with her principles intact. Over the following days, as he listened to the full story from Tommy and read the FBI reports, his perspective began to shift. "I was trying to protect you from living," he admitted during one late-night conversation. "I thought keeping you safe was the same as keeping you happy." Sarah arrived with their teenage son Tyler the following week, expecting to find a chastened grandmother ready to accept assisted living. Instead, they found a woman who had become an overnight symbol of wildlife conservation, with reporters calling daily for interviews and conservation groups offering speaking engagements. "Grandma's famous," Tyler announced, scrolling through social media on his phone. "There's a hashtag #BearGrandma. People are calling you a hero." But Maggie felt anything but heroic. She'd saved one cub while 47 other bears had died horrible deaths. The mother bear, the magnificent creature who had protected her with the ultimate sacrifice, was gone forever, leaving behind an orphaned baby whose future remained uncertain. The wildlife rehabilitation facility where the cub had been taken sent regular updates. Buttercup, as the staff had named her, was thriving physically, but showed signs of psychological trauma. She wouldn't eat unless humans were present, apparently having bonded so deeply with Maggie during their brief encounter that she now sought human contact for comfort. "It's unprecedented," the facility director explained during a video call. "We've never seen a wild bear cub imprint on a human this way, especially one she knew for such a short time. She seems to be waiting for you." The revelation broke Maggie's heart. Here was another innocent creature whose life had been forever altered by the violence she'd witnessed. The cub's mother was dead, her natural development disrupted, her future as a wild animal possibly compromised, all because Maggie had failed to save them both. O'Brien's trial began 2 months after the shooting, with Maggie testifying via video link from her rehabilitation facility. The man who appeared in court bore little resemblance to the confident predator she'd faced in the mountains. Prison had broken him completely, and his confession was painful to hear. "I told myself I was honoring Emma's memory," he said, his voice barely audible. "But the truth is, I was drowning in grief and took 47 innocent lives down with me. That bear died protecting Mrs. Sullivan because she had more humanity than I did." The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, but for Maggie, the legal victory felt hollow. Justice for the dead bears wouldn't bring them back, wouldn't reunite Buttercup with her mother, wouldn't undo the trauma that had left a baby animal psychologically dependent on human contact. Pete received 15 years for his role in the operation, testifying against the larger trafficking network in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation led to arrests across 4 countries and the dismantling of a supply chain that had been devastating wildlife populations for over a decade. "Some good came from all this," Tommy told Maggie during one of his visits. "The investigation shut down trafficking routes that were killing hundreds of animals annually. Your testimony helped change federal sentencing guidelines for wildlife crimes." But even these victories couldn't ease the weight of loss that settled over Maggie like a winter shroud. She'd left her cabin that morning planning to scatter Frank's ashes and accept her son's plans for her future. Instead, she'd witnessed murder, experienced the profound intelligence and sacrifice of wild creatures, and emerged forever changed by the encounter. The decision about her living situation remained unresolved. Her medical needs now required more support than independent living could provide, but the thought of institutional care felt like another kind of death. She'd tasted what it meant to matter, to make a difference, to connect with another living being on the deepest possible level. How could she go back to merely existing? "What if we brought the facility to you?" Michael suggested during one conversation. "We could modify the cabin, hire full-time nursing care, set up everything you need to stay home." It was a generous offer, and Maggie knew it came from genuine love and guilt in equal measure. But something else was taking shape in her mind, a possibility that had emerged from the ashes of tragedy. The wildlife facility had extended an unusual invitation. Would she consider becoming a volunteer educator, using her story to teach visitors about human-wildlife interaction? They could provide on-site medical support for her diabetes, and her presence might help Buttercup transition more successfully toward eventual release. "I'd be living at a zoo," she told Frank's photograph, which now sat beside her hospital bed. "You'd probably say I finally found where I belong, surrounded by creatures more honest than most people. But it wasn't really a zoo. It was a sanctuary, a place where damaged animals learned to trust again, where orphaned babies found new families, where the worst tragedies sometimes led to the most profound healing." As winter gave way to spring outside her hospital window, Maggie found herself thinking not about endings, but about beginnings. She was 73 years old, medically fragile, and forever changed by violence she'd never asked to witness. But she was also the woman who'd earned the trust of a wild bear, who'd inspired international conservation efforts, who'd proven that courage had no expiration date. The question wasn't whether she was ready to die peacefully in a comfortable facility. The question was whether she was ready to live purposefully in an uncertain world, surrounded by other survivors who understood that sometimes the greatest healing came from serving something larger than yourself. Outside her window, the Montana mountains beckoned with the promise of another spring, another chance, another opportunity to matter in whatever time remained. 1 year later, Margaret Sullivan stood at the exact spot where everything had changed, watching the morning sun paint the Montana peaks in shades of gold and rose. The pit where Buttercup had fallen was now covered with thick ice, nature reclaiming the space where tragedy had transformed into something approaching grace. She wasn't alone. Michael stood beside her, no longer the anxious son trying to manage an unruly parent, but a partner in an adventure neither of them had expected. Tyler, now 17 and accepted to Montana State University's wildlife biology program, was setting up camera equipment to document their annual pilgrimage. Even Sarah had come, carrying hot coffee in thermos bottles and wearing hiking boots instead of her usual heels. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Michael asked, though his tone carried support rather than resistance. "The trail's more challenging than the rehabilitation center paths." "I've been training for this all year," Maggie replied, tapping the glucose monitor discreetly attached to her arm. Her diabetes was better controlled now, managed through a combination of improved diet, regular exercise, and the purpose that had given her life new meaning. "Besides, I made a promise." The promise had been whispered to a dying bear a year ago, a vow that love would triumph over violence, that sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, that the innocent would be protected. It had taken 12 months to fulfill, but today marked the culmination of the most important work of Maggie's 74 years. At the Margaret Sullivan Wildlife Education Center, a name that still made her blush with embarrassment, she'd spent the year teaching thousands of visitors about the intelligence and emotional complexity of bears. Her story had become the centerpiece of a revolutionary education program that challenged people's assumptions about wildlife and the interconnectedness of all living beings. But the real work had happened in the rehabilitation enclosures, where Buttercup had slowly learned to be wild again under Maggie's patient guidance. The cub, now a magnificent yearling weighing nearly 100 pounds, had required delicate handling to overcome her human imprinting while retaining the trust that made her an exceptional ambassador for her species. "There," Tyler pointed through the trees, his young eyes sharper than his grandmother's. "Movement by the old oak." Maggie's heart stopped as a familiar brown shape emerged from the underbrush. Buttercup had grown beautiful, her coat thick and glossy, her movements confident and strong. But it was her eyes that took Maggie's breath away. still intelligent, still aware, but now truly wild in a way that spoke of successful rehabilitation. "She remembers," Michael whispered, watching as the young bear approached with cautious recognition. Buttercup stopped 20 feet away, close enough for connection but far enough to maintain her natural wariness of humans. She was no longer the helpless cub who had needed rescue, but a powerful wild animal who had chosen to acknowledge the humans who had saved her life. For several minutes they simply looked at each other across the space that separated civilization from wilderness. Maggie saw in those dark eyes the reflection of her own journey. From helpless victim to purposeful survivor, from passive recipient of care to active guardian of others. "Thank you," Maggie said quietly, her words carrying across the mountain air, "for teaching me what courage really means." Buttercup tilted her head in a gesture that might have been coincidence, but felt like understanding. Then, with the fluid grace of a creature born to these mountains, she turned and disappeared back into the wilderness where she belonged. The family stood in reverent silence for several minutes, processing what they'd witnessed. This was more than a successful wildlife release. It was proof that healing was possible, that trauma could be transformed into strength, that love could bridge the gap between species. The Emma and Honey Foundation wants to fund 3 more education centers, Michael said eventually, breaking the sacred quiet. 1 in Yellowstone, 1 in Alaska, 1 in North Carolina. They want you to consult on all of them. Maggie smiled at the irony. O'Brien's daughter, the little girl who had loved animals, was now inspiring conservation efforts that would protect thousands of creatures like the ones her father had killed. The foundation, established with O'Brien's seized assets and supplemented by donations from around the world, had become a powerful force for wildlife protection. "I think Emma would like that," Maggie replied. "She'd be proud that her name is associated with saving animals instead of destroying them." Tyler finished packing his camera equipment, having captured footage that would become part of the center's new documentary. "Grandma, do you think Buttercup will come back next year?" "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "She's wild now, as she should be, but I hope she'll always know that she has friends in these mountains, people who will fight to protect her world." As they began the hike back to civilization, Maggie felt Frank's presence more strongly than she had since his death. He would have loved this story. The way violence had been transformed into conservation, the way an old woman's stubborn refusal to go quietly had sparked international change, the way love had proven stronger than grief. The Margaret Sullivan Wildlife Education Center now welcomed over 100,000 visitors annually, and similar facilities were opening across North America. The Bear Grandma story had become a powerful tool for conservation education, inspiring a new generation of wildlife protectors. But perhaps more importantly, it had proven that courage had no expiration date, that purpose could be found at any stage of life, that the connections between humans and nature ran deeper than most people dared to imagine. At 74, with her diabetes managed and her family united around a shared mission, Maggie Sullivan had found something better than a comfortable retirement. She'd found a legacy worth living for, one bear at a time. At 73, Margaret Sullivan thought her story was ending, until a baby bear taught her it was just beginning. Like so many of us approaching our golden years, Maggie faced the heartbreaking choice between safety and purpose, between existing comfortably and living meaningfully. Her son wanted to protect her in a nursing home, but her heart yearned for one last adventure, one final chance to matter. When she witnessed that mother bear's ultimate sacrifice to save her, Maggie discovered a profound truth. Age doesn't diminish our capacity for courage. It concentrates it. The woman who saved 200 bears and inspired international conservation efforts wasn't a superhero. She was an ordinary grandmother who refused to let her final chapters be written by fear. Today, at 74, Maggie runs wildlife education centers that welcome thousands of visitors annually, proving that our most important work often begins when society tells us we should be slowing down. Her diabetes is managed, her family united, and her purpose crystal clear. Sometimes the wilderness finds us when we need it most, reminding us that there's no expiration date on making a difference. Your greatest adventure may still be waiting, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday when you choose purpose over comfort. What dream have you been postponing because you think you're too old? Have you ever felt more alive when helping someone else than when focusing on your own safety? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to embrace their next chapter with courage.